Heidi here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And I'm here for another 5 ways to save video. And let me tell you, I'm having a great time reviving this old series from a few years ago. And today it's going to be about gardening. So let's just get right into the 5 points I chose for today. And the first one is in regards to fertilizer and how you can you should not ever have to buy fertilizer. So when we first really started getting our garden off the ground, besides using wood shavings from Patrick's shop all over in all the garden areas, and it was totally free. And it also helps hold in moisture. But there was also some horses right down the road that we used to be able to get horse manure from. And so usually February, March, Patrick would start bringing buckets home. And he'd just drive his backhoe down there and bring it back. We have a couple of videos on that. I'll link to the last one that we did. Unfortunately, a couple of years ago, they got rid of the horses. And I decided that, especially after that last batch of horse manure, I wasn't going to do that anymore because, as one can expect, if you're not getting a good aged horse manure, you can end up with a lot of stuff coming up in your garden. But the good thing is a lot of the stuff that started coming up were things that were also medicinal and have uses to them. So even the lady's thumb was one of the big ones. It comes up everywhere, but it's edible and it has a lot of nutrition in it. So just in case you didn't know that, and you've got that weed growing in your garden, weed, kind of like plantain being a weed or dandelion being a weed. There's so many things that you most likely have right there that's free to you. And a lot of people might not even realize the benefits of grass clipping. And when we're talking grass clippings, we're talking about those that have not been sprayed with Roundup. And so we get, especially now that we have that other piece of property down the road that Patrick has to mow quite a bit during the summer. He'll spend a day mowing that property, and then we'll go out there and rake up the grass clippings. And, we might take several trips and start bringing those home and dumping them on all the garden beds. So there's some I really especially like putting them on, that's any place that I'm either trying to build up the soil or I'm growing anything that likes more acidic soil, like potatoes and corn in particular. And then on the pots and the where the blueberries are growing or any other berries I have growing in pots, I especially like to pile them on top of there. But I'll put them around everything. As long as you don't get too carried away with the things like your zucchini and other types of things that don't like too acidic of a soil, you can still put a layer of grass clippings around those plants as long as you don't mix it into the soil. And what that does is it will help hold the moisture in. And as it slowly starts to break down, it will still feed the soil. And I haven't had any problems with the grass clippings killing any of my plants, even those non-acidic soil loving plants. It just depends on how you use it. But when it comes to the potatoes, I pile it high, right on top of the plants. So instead of piling soil on top of them, we just keep putting more grass clippings on top. Really, really great for the potatoes. And then during the fall, whenever I can get leaves from my neighbors, when they're raking up their leaves, and they're usually happy to bring them over because otherwise they're running them to the dump and paying to have them dumped. So they're happy to bring the leaves over. And so in the fall, I'll start piling that on top of all my garden areas and let that break down over the winter. It puts a nice protective layer over the soil. And then as they start breaking down through the winter, then, that's going to feed the soil. It's going to fertilize it. And the chickens love to dig through that too. And then you also have, if you have a fireplace, a wood stove, a cook stove, wood ash is really great for the gardens because it adds minerals. Take those wood ashes and put them in the garden. Just be careful about not getting it too thick. You're either going to want to mix it in with your soil, which we'll do in the main garden area, or if I'm just going to dump it, I'll dump it around perennials like our fruit trees, or the various herbs, things like that. And then, as I said, for the main garden, when we put them in there, that's usually when we till it up. So we do now, the last few years, we started tilling the certain garden beds. Not all of them. It just depends which ones they are. You can do the no-till method. It's great. But sometimes it's best to go ahead and stir things up. It gets all the slug eggs and baby slugs up, so the chickens will eat on that and any other pests that are in the soil. That's when we'll add the wood ash to the main garden, so that we can till it in with everything else, along with sawdust and wood shavings from Patrick's shop, which also helps aerate the soil as well. And the same goes with kitchen scraps. We don't have a set compost bin, which is a great thing to have. But instead what we do, because I really don't even want one. I don't have a good place for one. What I do is all through the year, kitchen scraps get thrown directly into the garden. That's just how it works, even while it's growing. In that case, it kind of depends on, I'm a little more particular about where those things go, but I try to make sure they go under plants. Banana peels and whatnot are great because they have so many minerals that can feed the soil, but it might look kind of ugly. So I like to put them under things so it's not quite so obvious. Someone, especially out in the front garden areas, it looks a little nicer that way. A lot of your kitchen scraps, just throw them in your garden or compost them and then do the whole compost bin and all that stuff and then put that in there too. So there's a lot you can do that's free when it comes to fertilizing and having a good mulch layer on top of your gardens. And then if you don't have a tiller and you can't afford to go buy a tiller, then doing a layering type method of gardening can really be helpful. Only downside to this is you got to start a minimum of 6 months ahead of time. And there's many different methods. One year what I did was, we didn't have a tiller at the time, and I wanted to extend my potato patch in the backyard. And instead of digging up all the grass and all that, what I did was I took a bunch of newspaper, and I know, people talk about toxins in newspaper and cardboard, but you got to work with what you have. And I needed to get that started, so I laid down layers of newspaper, didn't have wood chips to put on there like a lot of people pay to get. But what I did was just on the churchyard, there's a church right over here, and the neighbor right behind us used to run a community garden over there. As such, people were bringing a lot of their grass clippings, and when they would thatch their yards, mostly because we get a lot of moss, so a lot of that was to pull the moss out. Moss is a great fertilizer, so they would throw all that in there. And so we did this big old pile, and I was going over there and just wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, filling that thing up, bringing it back to the house, and I piled that thick on top of the newspapers. And I did that actually, I think, 2 months ahead of the time before planting. And even though I knew it was too soon, I decided I'd put potatoes in there anyway. And believe it or not, it broke down good enough in that short period of time, and I was able to grow potatoes in that extended area, much to my surprise. But really, it is best at least 6 months, even a year ahead of time, to start something like that. But then you never have to till. It'll naturally, the layer of newspaper or cardboard will kill the grass and weeds that are under it. After it does that, it will break down and start to feed the soil. And that's why you also need that layer on top, is not only will it hold that stuff in place, but it will also break down and start to turn into soil. It is a real great method to do. And so basically, I have quite a few garden areas that's just all I do. I just pile stuff on top of there. Unfortunately, there's no community garden over there where I can get a bunch of the grass clippings and moss, but thankfully, we do have that property down there where we can mow and get all those great grass clippings. And then here's another thing, is during the time of the year while your garden is growing, any excess herbs that you have, especially things like borage, plantain, things that grow quickly and you have a lot of, dandelion greens, dandelion leaves, if you've already dried up enough and you feel like you got plenty, then just start taking those things and doing a chop and drop. You can do that with all kinds of greens. Just cut them down, whether it be even pull the plant up by the root and throw that down and let it naturally break down. But I've done that where just a chop and drop, just go through, it's like, okay, I got plenty of this stuff, and just throw that on top of there. And another good thing that I found entirely by accident is when I was doing that, and this is before I had chickens to help keep our slug population down, is that when you do that, the slugs they'll eat dandelion leaves as long as they're starting to break down. So the slugs actually get drawn to those things that are starting to die, and they'll eat those instead of devouring your whole garden. And no, beer and dishes doesn't work here. I gotta say every time, because every time I bring up our slug population here, people want to tell me about beer and dishes. I've heard about it for years. I tried it for years in many different methods. It does not work here with our slugs. Trust me on that one. But I found methods that do, and believe it or not, chickens have been one of the best things we've had to keep our slug population down. So rain country, lots of slugs. And by the way, I even did a video on how to control slugs, your slug and snail population that I'll link to down below. And I did include the bear method because I know that works for some people. So anyway, there's a way you can get away with not having to invest in a tiller. Having a no-till garden is great. There's some situations where it's nice to have, or you might still need to till some stuff up. But especially if you just can't afford to rent one, buy one, or don't know anyone that has one, that is something that you can do at least to get started. And then point number 3 is growing as many perennials as you can, because the great thing about perennials is once you got them established, you don't have to, there's not a whole lot you have to do to care for them, and they'll just keep coming back every year. A lot of your mints need very little care. In fact, the only thing you got to worry about those really is just keeping them contained, or they can take over. But I grow my peppermint in places I want it to take over, and a lot of my other mint family plants are easy enough to keep contained. Every spring I just go back and thin them back to where I want them. That's how I take care of it. And having a good loose soil is good for that. But here's the other thing about perennials is not only can you be a little more certain they're going to keep coming back every year, not always. Anything can happen that can kill a perennial, but you don't have to worry about buying seeds every year when it comes to perennials. And so then the next point, though, is obviously we still have annuals that we want to grow every year. Like, maybe you like to grow green beans like I do. Well, then it's important to learn how to save seeds, because then you don't have to keep buying seeds every year. The only reason you should be buying seeds is if you're wanting to try something new. You're wanting to add more stuff to your garden. But even then, look at bartering with friends and neighbors for seeds that they may have, or even young plants, because I usually have a lot of young marshmallow plants coming up, or lemon balm plants, and I'm happy to share those with family and friends. Anyone who's interested in growing that stuff, I'll just give it to them. Or you can even start selling those and make a little bit of profit off of that, or trading them for some seeds or a plant that somebody else has. So consider those kind of options there. But the saving seeds obviously being number one. Even off of your perennials, it's a good idea to have at least, save a few seeds every year just in case something happens to that perennial and it doesn't come back. You may want to, like echinacea. I always have at least 1 or 2 echinaceas that something happens to. Usually it's Patrick mowing over it or tilling it up. And so I have to start new echinacea every year. Thankfully, I always have at least 1 or 2 that remains untouched. But that's just an example. So every year I save seeds for my echinacea so I can start new plants, so I can always make sure I have echinacea growing. And then another thing, and this one up front is not going to be a money saver because it might be an investment, is consider setting yourself up some kind of rainwater catchment, because what that's going to do over time is it's going to pay for itself. Once you have a good rainwater catchment set up, you can save a lot of money. This is, of course, if you don't already have a well. But even if you do have a well, you might want to still have another way to have water. And so we have a rainwater catchment system. I did a video on that. And what most people will see is they might think we only have 110 gallons of water in storage. Nope, we have a lot more than that. It's just you can't see it. So if you're interested in our setup, please go check out the video I put in the description box down below. Even though we live in rain country, a minimum of 120 inches a year annual rainfall, we do have dry months in the summer. Not always, not every year, but there's a lot of years we can go even as long as 3 months without rain. And that's, of course, during the time of year we're trying to grow things. So having that rainwater catchment is a great thing to have to use to water our garden with. Plus, the rainwater is going to be much better for your gardens than the city tap water with the chlorine and the fluoride in it. And even though I still use that to water too, I do both. And having that rainwater setup was great, especially during the time that one year we had a super dry summer where even the city well was running low when they were putting people on water restrictions. Well, it wasn't a big deal. We had our rainwater catchment. We do have like a pump set up that's hooked up to our solar power so we can pump that water and water everything, all of our gardens with that rainwater, and we don't have to worry about what kind of restrictions the city's put on. It'll pay for itself, and then it will save you money definitely in the long run. So anyway, there's my 5 points on that. I'm sure, and there's more I could cover, but again, this is just a 5 points video, but I also like leaving the floor open for other people to share what are some ways that you have saved in your gardening instead of going out and buying a fancy this or a fancy that. What have you been able to do to save money in putting in a garden and growing, continuing to grow a garden or whatever it is you're doing, or even making money off your garden to help pay for new things like building a greenhouse and so on, selling your seeds, selling your starts, selling your produce. These are all things that can cut the cost. So share with us your stories down below. And don't forget to check out my full 5 ways to save playlist that I'll be putting a link to in the description box down below. And thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.